You know that feeling, right? You spend hours and hours memorizing grammar rules, you've got these huge vocabulary lists down, but then you try to do something simple, like order a coffee, and it all just falls apart. Well, that gap between knowing a language and actually using it, that's precisely what we're tackling today. We're diving into an approach called communicative language teaching, or CLT for short. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to nail down exactly what CLT is. Then, we'll get into its core principles, the why behind it all. After that, we'll take a peek into a real CLT classroom, check out its biggest advantages, and wrap up by looking at some of the common criticisms and challenges. Pretty straightforward. Okay, let's kick these off with the big question. What is communicative language teaching? You know, at its core, it's really a massive shift in how we think about the whole point of learning a language. And here's the absolute key takeaway. CLT isn't just some new teaching method with a bunch of fun activities. Nope, it's a whole philosophy. The goal here isn't to become a walking grammar encyclopedia. It's to build something called communicative competence. And what's that? Well, it's simply the ability to actually use the language to get things done out there, in the real world. Think about it this way. The old school approach was all about grammatical knowledge, right? Knowing the rules, the structures. That's kind of like memorizing a cookbook cover to cover. You know all the ingredients, all the steps. But can you actually cook? On the other hand, the CLT goal is all about that communicative competence. It's about getting in the kitchen and actually making a meal. It's about using the language to achieve a real purpose. So what's really driving this whole approach? To get it, you've got to look at the core principles, the foundational beliefs that really shape what happens in every single lesson. Okay, so what are we talking about here? Well, first off, the absolute focus is on real communication. The activities have to actually mean something to the learner. And here's a big one. Fluency is seen as being just as important as accuracy. That means making mistakes isn't a bad thing. Actually, it's a totally natural and expected part of the process. The whole point is to get learners to experiment, to play with the language, and to mix all the skills together: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. All right, so that's the theory, but what does this actually look like in a classroom? How do you put all these ideas into practice? Let's go ahead and take a look. You know, the first thing that would probably jump out at you is how the roles have completely flipped. The teacher isn't standing at the front of the room, just lecturing. Instead, they're more of a guide, a facilitator. And the students? Well, they're the ones doing the heavy lifting. They're the communicators actively working things out with each other. So, a perfect example of a CLT technique, and one you've probably all heard of, is role play. But here, it's used with a really specific goal in mind. So why are role plays so great for this? Well, they let students practice communicating in all sorts of different social situations. They give them the freedom to figure out what to say on their own, which, well, that creates this natural unpredictability. It's just like a real conversation, right? You have no idea what the other person is going to say next. It forces you to listen and respond on the fly, which is amazing practice. Okay, moving on to another classic CLT technique, the information gap task. And honestly, the name pretty much tells you everything you need to know about how it works. So here's a classic example. You pair up students. Student A gets a picture, and student B gets a slightly different one. Now, without looking at each other's pictures, they have to talk and figure out all the differences. See, student A has info that student B needs, and the other way around. There's a genuine reason to talk. They have to ask questions, describe what they see, all to get the task done. And success isn't about perfect grammar, it's about finishing the task. The language becomes a tool, not just a test. Now, if you take that information gap idea and scale it up for a group, you get what we call a jigsaw activity. It just adds a whole new level of teamwork. Here's how it works. You split the class into small groups, and each group gets just one piece of the puzzle, maybe one paragraph of a story or one part of a problem. Now, for anyone to understand the whole story, the groups absolutely have to talk to each other. They've got to share what they know to piece it all together. It's this dependency that really gets them collaborating and working things out. All right, so we've seen these really engaging hands-on techniques. But what's the bottom line? What are the real benefits of teaching this way? Let's break down why this approach is so popular. Well, the advantages are pretty compelling. For starters, students just end up talking more and getting more involved. And because the pressure to be perfect is off, it really boosts their motivation and just makes the classroom a less stressful place to be. It creates this really positive, cooperative vibe. But maybe most importantly, it puts students in the driver's seat, making them more responsible for their own learning journey. Of course, no approach is a magic wand, right? CLT is no different. It definitely has its critics and faces some real-world challenges. And it's super important to take a balanced look at those too. So, what are some of the hurdles? Well, for some teachers, CLT can feel a little vague. It's not a strict recipe, so it can be hard to know if you're doing it right. Then there's that big debate, fluency versus accuracy. If you're not correcting every little mistake, are you letting students form bad habits? Plus, let's be honest, not every student loves group work. And finding or creating all this authentic material, that's a huge time commitment for teachers. This really gets to the core of a big debate within CLT itself. There's what people call weak CLT and strong CLT. The weak version is what you see in most textbooks. It's about learning to communicate. You learn the grammar, then you do an activity to practice it. But strong CLT, that's a bit more radical. It says you learn by communicating. The idea is that the very act of trying to complete a task is what makes you acquire the language, not studying the rules beforehand. And so this whole discussion really brings us back to that fundamental question in language teaching. What's more important? Fluency first, even if it means making mistakes? Or should we always be aiming for accuracy, even if it slows us down? CLT really pushes us to put communication at the forefront, but finding that perfect balance, well, that's the ongoing challenge for every single one of us.